Welcome back to another Modern Problems YouTube channel video. Today I wanted to do kind of a one-off titled Tariff Talk, where I discuss President Trump's recent tariff policies that have come out in the past week or so and analyze them to kind of figure out what's the plan here, what is his goal, because it's not really outwardly obvious, and I think there's a few different avenues that you can look at. So I just wanted to take a deep dive and determine kind of what's really going on here, what can we expect, and what is the ultimate objective. So without further ado, let's dive right in. So the first thing we have to look at here is what are the actual tariff policies. So there's three main countries that were kind of targeted on Monday of this week, set to be enacted on Tuesday, which would be February 4th. So the target countries were, coincidentally, the US's three largest trade partners, so Mexico, China, and Canada, in that order, at least in terms of countries that the US imports from. And in this announcement, Trump called for a 25% general rate for Mexico and Canada, which are our two neighbors of the US, and then a 10% general rate for China, which is an adversary, decidedly. So kind of interesting there. We're kind of targeting what can be considered our allies. We have a pretty solid trade agreement in place from his earlier term, replacing NAFTA. So that's one thing to look at here, is that we're actually charging higher tariffs for our allies. Something else to note, Canada, so are the country we import the most energy from. There's only a 10% tariff announced there. So part of his energy policy, as he has stated, oil prices are lower. They would end the war in Ukraine. They would limit inflation and basically make everything better for the US. That's kind of the baseline. What actually ended up happening. So on Monday morning, President Trump and the president of Mexico got on a call and they announced that the tariffs would be postponed 30 days under the conditions that Mexico would strengthen resources at the border, bring troops and equipment there to kind of stem the flow of immigration, notably fentanyl. Later in the afternoon, same thing with PM Trudeau of Canada, pushed back 30 days, focused on the border, specific mention of fentanyl. Kind of interesting. I'll pull up a statistic here, but it's really not a large inflow of the fentanyl problem in the US through Canada, so something really kind of confusing there. Another thing to note is that the border measures, well, yes, it's very specific and we're going to bring this, this, and this here. It's kind of already policy, and there's no real changes to the kind of the plan for border security for either of these nations. So that's something interesting to note, that basically nothing changes, and there's a big show for no concrete changes from Canada and Mexico, who should be, our allied nations based on past trade agreements, military alliances, common policy. Interesting to note what happened there for China. Despite President Trump and Xi Jinping supposedly setting up a time to talk, that really never materialized. Supposedly Trump stiffed Xi, which would make sense with his leadership persona. So that 10% general rate did go into effect on Tuesday, notably excluding Hong Kong and Macau, but I mean, not super large manufacturers, so no huge impact there. And then one big, not necessarily an exception, but an asterisk is that the de minimis exemptions for small shipments, so under $800, so anything like cheap that you're getting from China, like your Shein, Temu, etc., that no longer is exempt from paying import duties. So, in typical Trump fashion here, we've had a reversal on one of these policies. De minimis has actually been reinstated for an uncertain amount of time until, quote, adequate systems are in place by the Commerce Department to fully and expediently process and collect tariff revenue. So, this one, we're rolling back for now. TBD what this looks like, and just a quick note here. So actually, according to US Customs and Border Protection, about 80% of e-commerce imports into the US in 2022 were de minimis provisions. So interesting to note the volume there. So that's overall what happened. Now we'll kind of jump into why he did this. how he did this, and what do we think the implications are for the future. So, first thinking about the why, a big part of Trump's policy is using tariffs as both a means of a negotiating tactic, and that's as well as a way to raise government revenue. So then, you can lower the income tax, lower the corporate tax, all that kind of stuff. And then he really views trade deficits as the U.S. getting stiff, as the U.S. losing out in some sort of deal, as he's a very deal-oriented guy. So he wants to really tackle all these different things. It's part of his America First policy, protecting the U.S. with tariffs as kind of a primary measure, the most beautiful word in the English language. In terms of kind of the implications of these, supposedly it could raise upwards of $1.5 trillion of government revenue over a 10-year period. So pretty significant overall. But there's kind of the estimates of GDP going down as a negative effect, as international trade is a net contributor to GDP of about 0.3 to 0.4% during that same time period. And then, with energy and manufactured goods coming out of these countries, so energy out of Canada, manufactured goods out of China, Mexico, you're seeing upwards of an $800 cost per household in 2025 if these kind of all go ahead. Apologies for another brief interruption here, but as we know, Mr. Trump does not like to stand still. So, as of February 10th, he has enacted two more tariffs on steel and aluminum, so 25% on each of these. Notably, this is a continuation from his 2018 policy, where he had 25% on steel and 10% on aluminum. These are more targeted tariffs, which definitely make a little bit more sense in the grand scheme of things. They're going to allow U.S. manufacturers to be, one, more competitive, and two, charge higher prices, which is better overall, at least for the manufacturers. These do get passed along to consumers, especially in the form of car purchases. So something that makes a little more sense for Mr. Trump here, however, still kind of anti-consumer, but pro-large business, or at least pro-legacy business. So just wanted to pop in and make the video as up to date as possible, as Mr. Trump likes to stay busy with his signature Sharpie. In terms of more foreign policy, so Mexico, Canada, they both kind of took a united stance saying if these go through, uh, they're going to enact countermeasures on very specific goods. So they're not going to do a blanket tariff. They're going to target certain industries. Canada, so alcohol, stores in certain provinces were already taking off American brands off their shelves for certain alcohol brands. Similar to Mexico, Mexico, a big contributor to automotive parts, is kind of talking about the increased risk there, how they're going to look to make it hurt for American consumers for cars and automotives. Basically, every U.S. manufacturer, even if it's made in the U.S., is going to have a significant amount of the lower tier suppliers, tier two, tier three, in Mexico. Yeah, especially Tesla, which is kind of interesting given Elon Musk and Trump's alliance there. So, kind of hurting his ally, and we'll see. One of the things to look for is if there is any bad blood between the two because of this. And then looking to the more international scene, so obviously other countries are taking note, especially the European Union, a kind of target of Trump's in terms of regulation. So we'll see if tariffs come into play or some similar kind of strong arm tactic comes into play. We'll see, especially regulation of Silicon Valley firms in Canada, or in the European Union. In the European Union, like Apple, Google, both kind of facing some antitrust issues over there. Then there's the WTO. So China did file a complaint with the WTO, but nothing really is likely to happen there, as they don't really have any means of enforcement. No one really listens to what they rule. So there was rulings against Joe Biden's government, and nothing really happened there. So not much to expect there. But if we do look at kind of the overall goal of this, so what really happened? Not much. Not much really changed between Canada and Mexico besides sending message that the US is going to be transactionalist, they're going to be aggressive, and they're going to want to do things the hard way. Something you'll know about Mr. Trump, especially with his Gaza comments this week. He really likes to throw something out there that's really, outrageous, really outlandish, And then he uses that as like an anchoring point, reading Trump's art of the deal. This is all part of his negotiating strategy. Throw something wild out there, and then you kind of reel it back in to something that, while initially might have seemed impossible, it makes it a little bit more impossible when compared to, I don't know, turning the Gaza Strip into a new Riviera. So that's definitely a part of what's going on here. The US wants concessions from Canada and Mexico about tightening up the border. That's part of it. There's still 30 days here, so still about 26 days or whatever from the time of recording that the tariffs still could go into effect. So, are Canada and Mexico going to be able to appease Trump again in 30 days? What's going to happen there? Up in the air at the moment. But we do see Trump's kind of really throwing it all out there, really going to be, as this continues to happen. Not sure if the same response is going to happen if you can only do it so many times with this kind of idea of throwing out the outrageous there, putting a 25% tariff on our some of our closest economic partners. It only works so many times. He did follow through with China, so it does show some kind of muscle behind the voice, but it's really not the kind of persona that he probably wants. People are going to take him less seriously because he backed away so quickly. Doesn't really give him the strongman persona that he's probably craving so much. So that's something to see is this going to work in the future? I think it's really going to have diminished impact the more you do it. And then with China. I think it's just kind of a continuation of this trade war. They responded with 10 to 15% tariffs on mostly natural resources and machinery, so things that the US really needs for its manufacturing economy. Again, another goal of this to kind of reshore everything, bring things back into the US, make us a manufacturing economy. China's response here is really kind of in line with the original trade war. It's not necessarily effective. China really stands to lose from these tariffs. They really didn't want these to come on. They tried to negotiate. Nothing really came out of it. But China, with their kind of lagging domestic market, is really not doing too hot economically. So this is going to hurt. And I think Trump knows it. And I do think there is some kind of merit to this. In terms of the overall impact of the tariffs, I think it's twofold. Obviously, that there's some upside. I think the upside mostly applies to the Chinese tariffs as more of an adversarial economy, an adversarial government, political institution. On the other hand, trying to be super transactionalist with your allies, I don't think this is going to work out long term. These are two of our three largest trade partners, Mexico being the largest. I don't think it makes sense with the supply chain integration. I'm a big fan of nearshoring, so I do think that this is a negative on that regard. I think it makes the Trump administration appear weaker because they're not following through, they don't have a long-term strategy. I think they lose a little bit of respect in this regard. Overall, I think we're seeing a classic Trump administration, chaotic, all over the place, throwing things on the wall, seeing what sticks. The Chinese tariffs, I think, are more solid, are stickier in this case, so I think they're going to be more lasting policy of the Trump administration. Tariffs on Canada and Mexico, we'll see in a couple weeks here if they're serious or if it's just a negotiating tactic. I think it's a net negative, in my opinion, for the Trump administration to have these tariffs in place unless they're really undermining US manufacturing. But I think US manufacturing really is going to be for those final goods. I think that's where the US succeeds in that value add manufacturing. And I think having Mexico as a trade partner for those kind of lower tier suppliers, and then having Canada as a trade partner for additional energy, I think these all coming together and make a very strong North American economy, one that's very defensible, one that's self-reliant. And as long as US, Canada, and Mexico can work together, I think it's a positive overall. That's my take on these tariffs. I don't think much is going to change at the border. I think immigration policy success is going to be the deportations. I think, they're seeing a lot of impact already. I think they're mildly popular, especially with his base. So I don't think these trade threats are really where you want to be going in terms of immigration policy. I think that's a domestic issue. I think tariffs are an international issue, and I think they should be for adversaries, not allies. Overall, that's my take. I hope you guys enjoyed listening. I hope you learned something. I hope you've figured out what you want to look for in terms of these policies. And with that, I look forward to seeing you for the next Modern Problems YouTube channel video. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day.